My name is Lance Conrad, and I'm an author. I write books for a living. I went from crawling to sprinting. Now I could run through not just one world, but many. Live not just one life, but hundreds.
He wants to marry her. He'll have to come to Patron.
And how about a nice spoiled cousin who bullies him all the time, right? What if these two characters fell in love? What if these two characters fought to the death? Show me him standing up against an entire army single-handed and drove most of the race before hopping out to run the last one. That's a little bit different. True story, by the way. Somebody went on a trip or somebody came to town. There's your plots. I took that big old forehead and just crashed every brick, board, and brother in the house. Let me tell you a story.
Hello! Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me a Story. For those joining us for the first time, Tell Me a Story is a segment where we get to know someone interesting. Right? So we've had William Thorpe, the artist. We've had Cody Don Reeder, the artificer and scientist. And today we have Alan Johnson, the writer-fighter. And I just got to take a second. The ancient Greeks had an ideal warrior scholar. Right? They kind of had this idea that you needed to be able to not only win the debate, but the fight after. And I feel like our guest tonight really kind of brings that together. So, Alan, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks. Good to be here, and I hope I can do right by those ancient Greeks.
There we go. And where are you joining us from? Let's just set some groundwork here.
All right. Well, I'm here in South Carolina, here on the East Coast, and it's my home, and I love it here. And it's nice to be able to have bright, sunny days and the beach nearby.
Nice. Now, I understand you actually spent some time here in Utah. I'm here in Utah. What were you doing out here?
Well, I was out there. I actually got my degree in film from the University of Utah in Salt Lake. And then I lived out there for a while and worked. I did some acting for a little while and did some other works on film and other projects. And after a while, I decided I needed to wander back to the South. And so I made my way back here. But I did definitely have some fun and enjoyable memories of being there in the hills.
It's all about the adventures, right?
That's right.
Now, I'm going to jump right into it, and I'll have to admit to my audience, this is entirely selfish, right? This is just something that I want to know about. I hope it's interesting for you folks out there, but I got to be honest, this is for me. We got to talk about Hema, right?
All right, let's do it.
So, I'm actually going to let you lead us off and tell the people what it is. What is Hema?
Well, HEMA is an acronym for a Historical European Martial Arts. And what it is, it's a group of people that strive to research and train and sometimes compete in historical European sword fighting. Now, I say sword fighting, but it also includes things like pole arms, like pole axes and spears and staves. It can also include things like rapier and dagger and wrestling, pretty much anything that we can find a historic manual for or some sort of treatise on how to actually do this thing from the time period. We translate, we interpret and study, research, and train from those things. And that is the bulk of what HEMA tries to do. And then there's also a competitive wing of HEMA that engages in sportified version of, an attempt to recreate that style of fencing from this period.
Nice. So, first question, of course, is, Alan, how many people have you personally killed in these competitions?
Absolutely none. I've probably done more damage to myself than anybody else.
Yeah. Any stories there? Have you ever hurt yourself real bad while learning some of these skills?
I don't think. I guess so. I've had my nose broken 3 times through the course of training. The first time is I actually caught a buckler across the nose, and it kind of smashed it there. The second time was we were wrestling, and I had my face on the ground, and somebody rolled me over, and my head rolled, but my nose decided to go a different way, and that snapped it.
It was fine where it was.
The third time we were just boxing, and it just got hit. So, you know.
Okay. All right. Well, I already love it because, yeah, you have all these different disciplines feeding into this thing. Now, do you have a favorite sword?
If I had to pick one, I'd probably go with the broadsword, basket-hilted broadsword. Yeah. Something, this is a good example.
Ooh, show and tell. I love
Show
it.
and tell. Can't talk about swords without showing off a few.
That's
This
right.
is a classic example of a basket-hilt broadsword from the mid-1700s. Actually, a little bit earlier, early to mid-1700s. And this actual piece is based almost inch for inch on a museum piece in Scotland. It had a very gifted smith that made this for me. And it fits really great. It's fantastic. It weighs just shy of 3 pounds, and it just cuts like a dream. It's a beautiful, beautiful weapon. And this is probably as close to an original antique broadsword as you'll get in a modern reproduction. It's just a really, really fantastic blade. And I love its versatility. I love the hand protection that you get. It's really good at protecting your hand against cuts. And when things get nice and close, you can use it to remove teeth and shift noses to the side. I try to dole out a few since I've gotten some in return. And it's a beautiful, beautiful weapon. I love it.
All right. So a beautiful sword also has some dental capabilities. I like it.
Right.
It's important to have multiple uses for a tool. Now,
That's right.
as expected, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. It was always going to happen. Let's dial back just a little bit. How did you get into this? Like, did you just wake up this morning and say, I need more sword battles in my life? Because I got to admit, that's happened to me.
I don't see how people don't wake up wanting more sword battles in their life, but you know, no, I think like most people that come from the similar vintage, at least most men that come from the same age as I do, and a lot of women as well. It's not universally true, but I was raised on a steady diet of swashbucklers and whip cracking adventurers and space wizards with laser swords and Knights of the Round Table and musketeers and all sorts of things like that. Those were the stories that I was drawn to. That's what excited me as a kid. You know, anything longer than a ruler immediately became a sword or a lightsaber. And you know, I finally had to stop doing that. This was last week.
I would say why?
But, well, now I got the real toys I can play with. You know.
There you go. It was an upgrade.
Put the yardstick down. Use your real sword. But this one's right here. You know.
I still use the yardstick. I gotta say.
You got to. Or you finish a wrapping paper roll, the tube. You know.
Oh,
it's
heck
gonna
yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
the pool noodles.
The best thing about the wrapping paper tube is you can use it on children, right? Whereas the yardstick will get people calling the cops. But you know. Wrapping paper tube,
Make
just
sure
go to town.
The blinds are drawn, you know.
There you go. There you go. It's all good fun.
So yeah, I mean, I grew up. You know, those are my heroes. Those are the people that I wanted to be like. And eventually, as I got older, you know, I didn't really find an outlet for it until I started getting into college and actually started training with the sport fencing team. And ended up making the collegiate team and competed in Olympic style sport fencing for a few years. And then I had an experience where I was introduced to the world of historic sword fighting, and I didn't realize there was such a vast difference. And then that just changed everything for me.
Can you tell me about that experience?
At risk of losing much of my credibility. No, it's actually quite a fun story. So I was a decent fencer. I was a pretty good sport fencer. I wasn't like, you know, I wasn't going to be going to the Olympics or anything like that, but I won more than I lost. So I kind of knew what I was doing. I was introduced to an individual who was part of a Hema group, although at that point in time, Hema wasn't really a brand name. I think we just called it Western Martial Arts or something like that. And you know, he kind of introduced himself as, hey, we're going to do some historical fencing. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I do that stuff, and kind of smiled and said, okay. So I go out and join them for a practice, and he has a couple of rapiers there. For those that aren't familiar with it, it's some people affectionately refer to these things as Princess Bride swords.
Nice.
This is a rapier. So it's a very nice, great, fun weapon to play with, and it's light. It kind of resembles the sport fencing weapons, but not really. But anyway, so he handed me one of these things, and we get ready to spar, and I get in my very classic fencing pose, ready to go, and when we kind of said go, I had a mask on and a little chest protection, stuff like that. When we said go, I start towards him with my blade extended. This guy with a smile on his face steps up and he kicks my sword up in the air. Like I was still hanging on to it, but he kicks my arm up in the air. And before I can even say swash my buckle, he rushes in on me, grabs me around the neck, throws me over the hip, and slams me into the ground. The air leaves my body, and before it's invited back in, he stabs me about 3 or 4 times on the ground and then just steps back and smiles. And sputtering, I'm crawling to my feet. I get up and I gasp something about cheating. And he just looks at me and says, "This is a fight." And all of a sudden I'm like, oh.
And the light comes on.
and all these bombs are going off inside my head, because all of a sudden it's the reality of the shift between doing things to score the touch first versus hit and not be hit, and hit them as hard as you can, or at least strong enough that they don't come back and hit you. That whole concept completely flipped my perception of fencing upside down. And over the course of next few weeks, and then going on for the next number of years studying it, I realized it's got very little to do with Olympic style sport fencing. And in relatively short order, I left the sport alone. I kind of put that on the shelf and moved fully into the historical martial arts and stuff like that. At the same time that I was doing this, I was also getting into stage combat to use with my film work. And that was a whole nother, twist to the whole game as well. But that was kind of my introduction to the world of historical fencing.
Magnificent. And yeah, there was actually a question in the chat that you ended up answering beautifully. The question was, how different are Olympic fencing and Hema? Which I think you just answered very well. There's a lot more kicking, as I think what we all just got from that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of differences. Initially, if you look at it, the tools are quite different. In Olympic style sport fencing, you have 3 weapons. You have the foil, the epee, and the saber, and they're all shaped slightly different. They all have slightly different blades. This is a Olympic style sport saber. And actually it's an epee hilt that's on here, so that's not even correct. But it's very, very light. This thing is extremely light, very flimsy, and it bends quite a bit. And this thing just whips around really, really fast. But you can see, just compared to the rapier, how much thicker the rapier's blade is than the Olympic saber. And this is supposed to be the most stout of the 3 weapons. The other two
that's the thickest
thin.
of the fencing ones.
Yeah. So you can just see just from this, how much different it is. And then of course the rule set is quite different. In sport fencing, you're trying to get the first touch, and it's scored electronically. So it's just the lightest depression of a button for foil or epee, or the touch of the edge and the saber, and that's enough to score the point. And as long as you hit first, that's the goal. If you get hit second, then nobody cares. In historical fencing, if you're really fighting for your life, getting hit at all is a really bad idea. In fact, a lot of the historic manuals go into great detail about how to avoid double hits, and that's a big problem, especially when you do any kind of sport activity. The risk of getting hurt is practically taken away. The risk of getting killed is eliminated. So you're not quite as cautious as you would be historically, and you got to make sure that you are able to engage and attack and not be counterattacked or hit at the same time. So it changes things up quite a bit.
Well, that makes absolute sense. I know if I was in an actual sword fight with somebody, I don't think I'd be that thrilled about being stabbed second.
There is a great there's a great there's a great joke that was kind of written into one of these historic manuals in the 1600s. Right around 1600, there was an Englishman by the name of George Silver. He wrote a book called Paradoxes of Defense, in which he basically talked about how great his English style of fencing was and how horrible the Italian rapier fencing was. Basically, it's the same, my kung fu is better than your kung fu. It's been going on since the beginning of time. But he was mocking a guy named Cobb, who was a local of the area. And he's saying that Cobb was notorious for picking a fight, and then as soon as the fight started, or the second it started to look like he was going to be bested, he would turn around and run away. And this happened so much, they referred to this as Cobb's Traverse. So it became a local joke in the area that if somebody were to run away from the fight, they said he would take up Cobb's Traverse and flee the field, or something along those lines. So he definitely didn't want to be there the majority of the time when it looked like he wasn't going to win right off the bat.
Fair enough. All right. And then you say this sort of started to also integrate itself into your film studies, right?
Yes.
Actual fight choreography.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have to ask, and I realize this might set off a rant, but just how offended do you get at seeing bad sword choreography in major films?
When I was in my youth, it would really upset me. Now that I'm old, I'm a little bit more temperate about it, and I've learned new things as I've gone on. It used to upset me a great deal. It used to annoy me a great deal. Now that I have a little bit more perspective on the industry as a whole, how it works, I'm a little bit more lenient. When you see a bad fight in a movie, there are a million reasons why it could be bad. Films and especially television are notorious for not giving their actors adequate time to train and study and practice. And if you were to think about somebody saying, all right, I'm going to be in a movie where I'm going to be a concert pianist, and I want to do all my own piano playing, all my own stunts, right? It's a physical act. It's a stunt, right? So they want to do all their own piano playing. They want to be able to play like one of the best, pianists in the world. 5-6 weeks isn't going to do it.
No.
Nobody can be a concert pianist in 5 to 6 weeks. Same thing goes with being a sword master, looking like you've lived your entire life studying and training with the sword. There's no way a 3, 4, 5, 6 week training camp is going to make you look like you've spent your entire life studying this weapon. Even people that have studied for 3, 4, 5 years still make a lot of mistakes and do things that are dumb and stuff like that. So there's just not adequate time to prepare, and the actors really don't want to. They don't want to spend that much time. They might get 1 or 2 of these roles, in an entire career. And so it's not really worth them investing the immense amount of time to train and rehearse and stuff like that. So, that's just one of the many, many reasons why it could go wrong. But yeah, it doesn't really upset me as it used to. I think I have a little less tolerance when you have a project that has a really high budget, or has a lot of resources and it comes across really bad. I notoriously rag on Game of Thrones because for their budget, they should have done a lot better than what they did. But it is what it is, and there's not a whole lot you can do afterwards. So you just got to make the film.
Well, that was one of my next questions is, can you give us, again, kind of limiting it to things that, the general person will have seen, what are some of the best and worst out there? There's some films out there that are just laughably ludicrous, or some that you were surprised how well they actually did with keeping it authentic.
Yeah. Well, and this is, we might come back to this in a little bit, but the few of the best ones that in my opinion that show the best portrayal of historic swordplay. Rob Roy. It's either 95 or 96, I think, with Liam Neeson and Tim Roth. Had a couple of amazing fight scenes in that particular film. That was superb.
Nice.
There's a film from, I think, 77 called The Duelists. It was very early Ridley Scott, I think. So I think this is pre-Alien. It might have been 73. I think it was pre-Alien Ridley Scott or whatever. And that one was Napoleonic saber and small swords. That one was really, really good. The 1970s Three and Four Musketeers. Both of those films were really good as far as, being relatively true to that period and that style of sword fighting. Bad ones, I mean, you could the list on that one's a lot longer. And I mentioned Game of Thrones, and that one's a relatively recent one where it feels like they should have done a lot better for the scope of the project and the amount of budget that they had. They certainly could have done a whole lot better. There's that notoriously bad duel in one of the Bond movies, one of the Pierce Brosnan Bond films. I think Die Another Day, I think is what that one was. It starts out off in a little sport fencing school that's run by Madonna for some reason. And then it turns into this chaotic multi-weapon fight scene. It's shot really well, and it is entertaining for what Bond does. But as far as actual sword fighting goes, it was a little bit of a head scratcher.
Now, I fully understand if you don't even have an opinion on this, but I have a very specific inquiry, because there is an actor that I've heard, right? There's rumors, this might just be publicity, but who everyone said was just a natural swordsman. And that was Viggo Mortensen in Lord of the Rings playing Aragorn. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of hype that I've heard about just what a natural he was and how quickly he took to it. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, obviously I wasn't there, so I can't speak for, and that was Bob Anderson that did the fight choreography for that. And Bob Anderson knows what he's doing. He actually did the fight choreography. I think he did it for the Three Musketeers from the 70s.
Oh, really?
I think he might have done that. I might be wrong on that, or that might have been William Hobbs. Anyway, but he knows what he's doing. He's a very gifted choreographer. And he very well may be right. He may be, it's also one of those things where you're not going to have an interview with somebody like that and said, yeah, he wasn't any good. Yeah, he was really terrible. We had the worst time with him. So he's not going to trash his own actor in front of everybody. And again, it kind of compared to, I'm sure he was very gifted and he did well in the role. And everybody has stunt doubles, it's kind of one of those jokes in the industry. Whenever an actor says, I did all my own stunts, that's like saying all the words that came out of my mouth, I actually spoke them. What they don't say is that I did all the stunts that were portrayed by my character. So he's like saying, all the stunts that I did, I really did them.
I did every stunt that I did.
Yes, that's exactly right. So, but no, he did really well in the role. There wasn't too much demanded, but it worked really well for the story. So, and that's the other thing that I've kind of come around to as far as stage combat goes. These days, I'm less concerned with historical accuracy and more interested in if it's martially honest. And what I mean by being martially honest is, are the activities and the weapons and the manner in which they're being used and the armor, is that consistent with the context of the story that it's currently in? So it allows for more fanciful things as long as it's being honest to that world and to the physics of what's going on in that world. For instance, if you have a sword that's supposed to cut through everything, this is one of the things Game of Thrones was guilty of, is was it the Valerian steel or whatever it is supposed to be, their magic steel, the sword that's supposed to cut through everything, and and they show it plunging through like steel breastplates, which is ridiculous. But then when it comes in contact with other swords, nothing happens. So it's
Inconsistent.
it's not being martially honest, and there's a lot of other things that go along with that. But sometimes a film really doesn't need historical accuracy, and it depends on the tone of the film. For instance, there's a great classic musical called The Court Jester with Danny Kaye.
Love it.
Historical accuracy has absolutely no business being in that film. It would have been ruined if they would have squared off, and all. It's not supposed to be. It's not the right tone. So these days I try to think of, historical accuracy in swordplay is like a certain palette tone for a painter. Not everything should be painted in that palette tone, but you should absolutely know what it is and how to use it when it's appropriate.
All right. Excellent. Is there a favorite kind of scene like that you like to write about or choreograph? Is there a certain setup or trope that you just really connect with? Your favorite stuff to work on?
I think it's fun to do. I'm really big on setups and payoffs. So I love scenes with mentors where the young up and comer is learning their skills or being trained, and it's almost like the crane kick in Karate Kid or whatever. It's going to be, because they're focusing so much on the thing. It's going to pay off, and hopefully it pays off in a satisfying and emotionally productive way. It's really enjoyable to try and see that progression, and it's hard for an actor who is trying to portray somebody who is moving through that space, moving from somebody who is not quite good yet to somebody who's more competent and then very good throughout the course of the film, or at least adequate to complete the task. And so I enjoy the progression of tying the character's arc, their story arc, along with their physical arc as well for those type of scenes. So anytime that can happen, that's enjoyable to see that set up and then the payoff at the end.
I'd never really thought of a good coming of age story tracking with fight choreography. That is awesome. I love it.
Great.
Excellent. Now, we'll probably just come back to more sword stuff. That's largely inevitable. But real quick, let's keep the focus on you a little bit more. What's coming up next for you? Are you heading into a new film or a new direction? What's next for Alan Johnson?
Well, that's a very good question. As everybody knows, the world's been a little topsy-turvy over the last year and a half, 2 years, and we think we see a light at the end of the tunnel. Hopefully it's not another train coming at us or Darth Vader standing at the end of a hallway, because I don't know how much more of this that we could take. But hopefully we're coming out of this pretty soon and things will start getting back to normal. So obviously a lot of film productions over the last year and a half have been shut down, and television shows, and only the very highly funded ones can afford a lot of the safety protocols and the new medical things that have to be in place in order to safely shoot these things. And remember, a lot of these scenes where people are fighting and grappling, you're right in each other's faces. You're breathing all over people. And obviously that's a little bit of a concern right now. So there hasn't been a whole lot of work available in that recently. And hopefully that'll change soon. As far as writing goes, again, same type of thing. It's been funny because a lot of people have been saying how wonderful the pandemic's been for writers because they have all this extra time to write. Well, apparently those people don't have children.
Right.
Because that changes the dynamic quite a bit. So while my writing hasn't been quite as productive as it has been in the past, there's still been time to explore some new ideas. And some of my new things that are kind of coming down the pipe here are actually going into the world of publishing and doing books. I haven't really talked about it a whole lot publicly, but I am actually working on a book right now called The Author's Armory. And what it is, it's essentially a source book for writers and other creatives, how to incorporate weapons and armor and fighting techniques into their works of fantasy or fiction. It's intended to be a really quick, easy to access reference guide. Because, as you know, if you want to get information on swords or if you go to the internet, I mean, that can be a dumpster fire. That can take you so many different rabbit holes. And if you have a deadline or you just want to get something done quickly, it can be a big waste. I mean, sometimes all you want to know is, how much does this thing weigh? That's all I want to know. And you could spend an entire day wasted on the internet trying to find something that is accurate and legitimate. And then just trying to get that specific information. And that's what this guide is intended to be. And then kind of how to take all this historically accurate information and how do we incorporate that, especially into works of fantasy and things like that. So my whole philosophy is, if you want really good fantasy, you have to know what the baseline is. So when you make those twists and those adjustments into the fantasy world, you're doing it from a place of information, not of ignorance. So you're intentionally twisting certain things to accomplish a goal that is necessary for your story, rather than just making it up and hoping that you're hitting a mark that's relatively close.
Well, we've already had one comment in the chat of someone who's intending to buy your book, and I'd say I'm second in line. Because that sounds awesome. Now, again, going right back into it. So, when we've talked about swords and sword fighting and sword play and movies and everything, what other sort of weapons have you trained for? Because obviously there's more than just swords in what you called, I got to take a moment and say here, you called it Western martial arts.
Yes.
And I love how in Eastern martial arts, it's all these, the way of the open hand and, throws and judo and all this, unarmed combat. And when you say Western martial arts, I think I'm going to get a weapon and kill you. So I love that that dynamic. But anyway, yes, the question is, what other sorts of weapons have you trained with or you find especially notable?
Anything it's great. Anything on a pole or a stick is always wonderful. One of as you look back through history, there is just about every conceivable variation of taking a long stick and putting something sharp on the end. There's so much variety in pole arms and spears and those type of things. And those are always fun to play with. I also really like dagger work, especially because it's so close to wrestling. I really enjoy the grappling and the wrestling and the striking aspect of it. These manuals that we have from these time periods, some of them are specific. There'll be just a manual on the German Messer, which is a type of short, it literally translates to knife, but it's about a 2.5 foot long sword that kind of looks like a knife. And there's some that are specific to that, but the ones that are a little bit more expansive, sometimes at least half of the manual is giving over to wrestling and grappling, because it's such an integral part to understand how to fight. And again, it's not just a sword fight, it's fighting. And at a certain point, you will have swords. You're never guaranteed to keep those swords throughout the fight. And, these manuals show that throughout the course of the fight, you might start off with spears because range matters. And then you might close the swords, and it might close the daggers, and then it might be wrestling on the ground. And you have to be able to handle all those things and all the transitions between there. Of course, there's also things like maces and hammers and axes and stuff like that, which are always great. Those are a little bit more intuitive. We don't have a whole lot of period material on things like maces and hammers, because the physics of it are basically you take this heavy object and clunk somebody with it as hard as you can. There's not a whole lot of finesse to using a mace or a hammer, but they certainly were on the battlefield. And so
there's no great mace masters out there, that are
not that we've discovered, and it is kind of fun because, like all good sciences and all good studies, it's really the art of, this is the best idea we've had so far. And so we're always, going back over the manuals, finding new things, finding new descriptions or pieces of artwork. And we're like, all right, does this change what we know about it? And how does that, change our perspective and how we do things and stuff like that. So it's always really interesting to find the entirety of the art beyond just whatever sword is popular in that particular era.
All right. Excellent. Yeah, I just from a historian's perspective, the history of putting pointy things on a stick really is quite vast. I'd love to see the numbers sometime of the people killed throughout all of human history with spears versus firearms. Because, man, I wonder sometimes, because spears have always been this ubiquitous killing tool.
Yeah, that and arrows. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah, now that's one avenue I haven't ever gotten into. Historical archery and bowmanship and using crossbows and stuff like that. That's a whole other thing. And I haven't had an opportunity to get into that before, but there are people that, dedicate their entire study to projectile weapons and stuff like that from the historical periods. And it's really interesting. I really love seeing them doing testing on pieces of armor to see how effective the armor was versus different types of projectile weapons or spears or crossbow bolts. A lot of that will depend on, the range and the weather and all that type of stuff. But it's really fun to see those tests.
Oh, yeah. I love weaving slings with my children. Like you were saying, being locked in with your children, my first thought was, let's arm them.
Sounds like there's about to be a revolution.
Indeed. But yeah, some of those old things, the bolero slingers, and just amazing stories. But that's going to have to be for another night.
Right.
Well, we do have a couple questions from the chat that I'm going to relay to you. Mike, who is actually usually on here as my co-host for Stories Stream, wants to know, he's actually got two questions. Are there any fantasy books or series that you found especially authentic? And his other question was, what does a Hema competition look like?
All right. I'll start with the Hema competition. There's plenty of video. If you want to just look up Hema tournament on YouTube, you'll find lots of it. Generally speaking, the uniform of Hema tournaments is typically people in all black. It looks somewhat similar to Olympic style sport fencing outfit, except everything's thicker. The helmets have padding that comes down on the side and on the back of the head. The jackets are much thicker because we're using things like we're using weapons like this to strike people with, and and it's quite a bit different than a little saber or a foil. You will also frequently see padding or hard padding on the elbows and knees, and it's in a three-dimensional arena. It's like in a square or a circle as opposed to like on a strip in Olympic style sport fencing. So in most Hema tournaments, you'll have a referee in the middle and a series of judges. And when they call for action, they call for go, you go until there's a hit and they call halt. And then they'll reset, assign the score, and go again for either a certain amount of time or a certain amount of hits. And, you can hit on the arm, you can hit on the head, you can hit on the legs, and sometimes there's a point value assessed. The rules to each individual tournament are slightly different depending on the tournament and what they want to do. And sometimes they allow grappling and throws. Sometimes they try to discourage it. So it really just depends on the tournament. But generally speaking, it's a kind of a start and stop tournament setup. Where they're striking and trying, and some will penalize people for double hits or getting what's called an after hit. If you hit somebody and a split second later they hit you, that's bad. So you're penalized for allowing yourself to get hit, even if it's a split second later. So
that whole getting stabbed second idea.
Right. Yeah. And so it's definitely entertaining. Take a look. Yeah. And just, search for Hema tournaments, and there's plenty of footage to look at.
Now, are there any greats out there, like just incredible swordsmen or masters out there teaching, or maybe on YouTube, that you actually look to as heroes or mentors, or just especially good sources for material?
I'll pass on the masters idea. It's one of these things that's kind of not really a controversy, but something that's discussed a lot. And I personally have my opinions on it. typically we don't use the term master in our modern study of it. In my opinion, it's considered a dead martial art because there has not been an unbroken line of lineage from the time period. And so we're trying our best to recreate it. And obviously there's nobody alive that knows what it's like to get into an actual real life and death longsword fight. So can you really master something that you don't ever actually do? And there's some opinions, one way or the other on that. And I kind of feel that, you can't really. I think there's some very good instructors out there, at the risk of calling out some people and leaving some people out. And I won't say I think this person's a great sword fighter or this person isn't. One of my favorite sources for good material, though, I'll mention it, is Matt Easton. He has a YouTube channel. He works out of a school in London. I think it's in London, or at least in England, called Schola Gladiatoria. And he really knows the stuff, especially the history of weapons. And he actually, I think, is part owner in an antique weapons dealership. So he has all sorts of fun toys to look at, and he always has good material. So that's one source that I personally look to for really good information. And I agree with him like 98% of the time. So,
so Matt Easton. Matt Easton, Schola Gladiatoria?
Gladiatoria, yes.
Gladiatoria. Excellent. We have another question from the chat from One Bite Cake is the username.
Who doesn't like cake?
I got to admit, One Bite Cake, that really has to do with how dedicated you are. Am I right? One bite cake for one person might take another person a bit longer. I'm just saying, there's some
dedication
there.
Yeah. I love it.
Anyway, the question is, what about axes and fighting with axes? Is that like the maces where it's more like, club the other person as hard as you can, or is there some finesse there with axes as well?
We have yet to discover any historic manuals that specifically deal with hand axes and fighting. Now, obviously, you can extrapolate by experimenting with it, especially when you're working with things like shields and stuff like that. The head of the axe is really good at hooking things and pulling things, allowing you to open up things. So a lot of it is an experimental kind of archaeology study and experimental martial arts, because we don't have any actual manuals on using the axe. Now, we do have plenty of information on using a pole axe, which is a taller axe on a pole, and usually has some sort of hammer on one end and then the axe head on the other, usually a pointy thing up on top. There is a good amount of material on the pole axe, which was used all over Europe. And so German, Italian, even English sources all have manuals that talk about the pole axe. And the study of that, you're using a lot of the haft of the thing to try and wind and get an opening, hook people behind the legs or hook people behind the head, pull them down, and then thrust and stab. Or there are definitely some good techniques that are described with the pole axe. But as far as hand axes go, there's just not a lot of material on that.
I have to ask, are there poleaxe competitions at Hema competitions?
There's not a whole lot of them. Because of the nature of the weapon, it creates a whole lot of inertia.
That was hence my question, because I don't know, short of plate armor, how you could ever do that safely, because of the mass and the speed.
Yeah, in the Hema format, because of the lack of protection, it's really difficult to do that. Now, there are some people that are experimenting. I've seen with axe heads made out of leather or some kind of synthetic material like nylon. Some practice swords, like this one here, it's made out of a nylon material, and so it bends quite a bit. And this is a long sword that's made out of it's a synthetic material, and so some people are making axe heads and things out of this stuff, which it's got a much thicker edge, which displaces some of the impact, but it still packs a huge hit. Now, the other aspect of all this is that outside of Hema, there is another group that engages in historical fighting, and it's usually referred to as Bohert or armored fighting. And this stuff is people getting in full steel armor, or armor plating, things like brigadines and things like that, and using blunt steel, and it's full bore, and they use a lot of axes. They use a lot of halberds and pole arms, and a lot of people describe it as MMA with armor. It's not a perfect comparison, but yeah, Bohert or historic armored combat is something to look for. There's the Super Bowl of armored fighting is a competition called Battle of the Nations, and it's usually held at somewhere in Europe, either usually in, they've had it in Rome, and they've had it in Spain and Russia. Russia's really where it came. They were the ones that came up with this sport, and it's basically an armored version of what a tournament must have been like, or they're trying to recreate the tournament atmosphere using full armored, full contact steel fighting. Wow. And it is a sight to see. And in addition to duels, they're really known for having mass battles. So melees, they'll have 5-on-5, sometimes 10-on-10. One tournament, they even had 150 on 150, and it was massive. It was amazing to see. Did
everyone live?
They did.
Wow.
People do get hurt, but the armor works. The armor does its job for the most part. And, it's really a spectacular sight to see. I'm part of a group here in Colombia called the Palmetto Knights, and most of the people on the team do this style of fighting. They do this armored fighting, and they go overseas and compete, and it's pretty spectacular. And they get after it. They hit hard. It's really just a sight to see.
I was going to ask, because you speak very glowingly about these groups, I was going to ask if this was like, your Hema rivals.
In a sense, yes. One of the biggest points of contention between Hema and the Bohert crowd, Bohert Fighting, if you're actually trying to kill somebody in armor, you don't hit the armor. You don't hack at it and slash at the armor, because you can't cut through the armor.
It's also going to mess up your sword.
It can ding up your sword, but you'll probably be dead before it does too much damage. But the actual strategy to beat somebody in armor is to use a technique called half swording. It's where you actually grip the blade of your sword and you use it for leverage to try and thrust it between the gaps of the armor. So it's wrestling with a sword. And then you're trying to, whine and trip and throw people, get them on the ground. If you can get them on the ground, you can always pull out, the short and stabbies, and you're trying to get it into the gaps of the armor, into the slit of the helmet, underneath the helmet, in the armpit, behind the knee, in the groin, anywhere where the armor isn't. That is how you beat somebody in armor. You don't cut. However, because that's the effective way to kill somebody, you're not allowed to do that in the Bohert sport, because people would actually really get killed. Yeah. So it is documented that back in the day when they had these tournaments, a lot of them did not allow thrusting for that very reason. So they would hold these tournaments. They said you can only use the edge for hitting and striking, and so that's basically the rule set that they work with. No thrusting, because that is actually how you kill somebody. So Hema, who is much more concerned with historical accuracy, not necessarily historical accuracy, but how to actually fight and kill people with these weapons, will look at that and say, well, that's ridiculous, because you'll never kill anybody doing that. And Bohert says, well, it's, working for us. And besides that, we're recreating the tournament setting where they actually don't use thrusting. So they'll go back and forth. And it's my Kung Fu is better than your Kung Fu. In my opinion, it's all good. It's all fun. They're just different avenues. And so far, Hema has not jumped on the melee wagon. And that's certainly something that's really exciting to see, is there's fields full of people going at it. And that's very entertaining. But yeah, there is kind of a rivalry between the two sports.
I think I might have met one of those people. I was in Ukraine, in a city I think called Lugansk. It's not that I don't know what the town was called. I think it was while I was there. And I met this guy who had hair down to his shoulders. And it was in the middle of winter in Ukraine. and he didn't even have a jacket on. And he stalked everywhere, right? He just strode and just picked up snow to hold it in his hands while it melted. And later he showed us, this plate armor that he had been making. And these axes that he had been making, talking about he and his friends would get together and they'd all made this armor and they would just come together and go at it. And I just had that memory come back. I think this must have been one of these Bohert guys.
I absolutely think so too. In fact, most of the weapons and armor that people import for that sport come from Ukraine and from Russia and from some of those other Eastern Bloc countries, because they've been doing it for years and years and years. And so they've really figured out how to make these sporting tools and the sporting armor in a relatively cheap and safe manner for this craft.
Now, with the benefit of history, right? You can look back on all these different manuals and stuff like that. Was somebody's kung fu actually stronger? Like, were the Italians better duelists than the Spaniards, or was one sword objectively better than another? Like, was somebody's kung fu stronger?
No, not really. I mean, it always comes down to who is the individual that's actually participating and how lucky are they on that day, and in this case, MMA is a good comparison because we do see people that come from more of a wrestling background or people that come from a more Muay Thai background or a jiu-jitsu background. They all kind of cross-train with each other, but nobody over the course of time, nobody has ever clearly been the dominant, tradition in that particular sport. And again, it just comes down to who is the individual that's doing it, how good are they, and how good are they on that day. And also, what if it's a dueling type of situation, if it's different types of weapons, certain weapons do have inherent, benefits over others. Range is a big deal. Range really matters. If I've got somebody that's threatening me with a rapier or with an arming sword, a single-handed arming sword, my best bet is to stand back and use a spear. Anytime that I can hit my opponent and not be in range to be hit, that's a good thing. Of course, their strategy is going to be to close and try and eliminate my reach. And that's where, the physical chess comes into it. So, that being said, I don't think there's any one particular tradition or one particular region that was clearly better or more dominant than others. Although once we start getting out of the 1700s and into the 1800s, as firearms start taking over the battlefield, we really see a sharp decline in the skill set and the training of swordsmanship. It becomes less relevant. It becomes very militarized and very, brief in the way that they train people. And then it just, disappears entirely. It no longer becomes relevant. But yeah, right around that mid 1700s, getting into the 1800s, we really start seeing after that a sharp decline in the martial skill set of swords people.
And yeah, you said it essentially ended entirely. You said this was a dead martial art in that there are no more masters. All our students, which I kind of like actually, as just a concept, all our students. I imagine we will create our own masters in time, but yeah, there is that whole thing of when you're actually trying to kill somebody versus not. Well,
right.
We're coming down towards the end. We have one more question from the chat and one more question from me, and we'll start with the one from the chat. How does someone get started in HEMA?
All right, great question. There is an organization, or at least a group called the Hema Alliance, and they got a Facebook page, they got a website. The best thing is to look that up, and they have some sort of a club finder tool there where you can plug in your zip code and find the organizations that are closest to you. And that's really the perfect place to get started. And from there, you'll have people that can inform you on what type of gear to get, if they can get you any discounts, which is always helpful, and start your training that. So if somebody wants to get into HEMA, I would say find the HEMA Alliance and use their club locator tool and find something that's local to you. If nothing is local to you, there are tons and tons of instructional videos on YouTube on how to get started. Pick a weapon that you want to start with, whether it be longsword, rapier, sword and buckler, dagger, Italian longsword, slightly different than German longsword, broadsword, whatever you want to do, and start, doing research. And you'll find there are texts out there that can help you out. The other really fantastic website that everybody absolutely must visit is called Wichtenauer. It's a wiki page, and one of the kind of godfathers of Western martial arts or historical swordsmanship was a man named Johann Lichtenauer. And way back in the 1400s, I think, early 1400s, mid 1400s. And so it's Wichtenauer is the name of the website. And they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of digitized swordsmanship manuals and original source material for free available on that page. So that is a great, great source to start studying.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, here's my last question, and then we'll start to wrap up. I feel like we need to finish your character arc here. Just as a writer, I've got to, because we had your experience where you got into Hema, where you were a fencer and a Hema martial artist, showed you how much more of the world there was, shall we say.
Sure.
Can you give me a story on the other end of that? What was your glory moment? What was your finest moment in Hema where you won the fight, slew the dragon, got the girl, whatever? Like, I'm really asking you to brag here. What was your greatest moment here?
I don't know that I really have a specific moment like that. I'll tell you what really, really makes me happy, though. When I see that I've introduced somebody to something that makes them happy. When I've, helped somebody with research, even if it's just for research or helping them with their book or with their screenplay or with their fight choreography. If I collaborate with another person to create something that is enjoyable for them or fulfills a goal for them or fulfills even a fantasy for them, as far as, I want to be in a movie, where I can be one of these types of people, and to see them experience that joy of, for this day, I was that guy, or for this day, I was that woman that got to do this thing that, I just dreamt about. To me, those are the type of, moments that really solidify it for me at this point. I'm to the age now where I'm not really competing all that much. It's kind of a young man's game or young person's game. And it can also, it can get a little costly, and with, family responsibilities, there's certain things that just kind of take, by the wayside, but nothing really beats those moments where you can, you've been able to train somebody. I do recall one film that I worked on where a guy was really struggling to get his choreography. It was a movie about a stage production. And there was a duel scene in the stage production, and he was really having a hard time getting his choreography down. And he was like, I'm going to ruin the movie. Everyone's going to hate me. And so we spent a little extra time, just drilling this thing over and over and over and over again. And he was, the day of the shoot, he was in the bathroom. He was throwing up all over the place. He was just a physical wreck. And he got out there and he nailed it. And he just did flawless, and he did perfect. And he came up to me afterwards and he's like, you made this happen. I'm like, I didn't do it. You did it. You put in the work, you put in the time, you put in the effort, you had the desire, you had the skill, and you made it happen. And so those are the glory moments for me. Those are the ones that really stick out and keep me wanting to do more.
I respect that. Yours is the joy of a teacher. Now, if there are people listening or watching later who would like to find out more about you specifically, your choreography, your book, how do we find you, Alan?
Well, I have a little bit of a presence on places like Instagram and Facebook, and I also do I just barely started a YouTube channel, and most of it is my information about screenwriting tips and stuff like that. But I also have some sword related stuff on there as well, especially as it relates to things. For instance, I have a video on there, the 5 most overlooked weapons in fantasy. So those type of things are fun to talk about and explore. But yeah, I'm assuming we can do something in the show notes where we can get those links available. But yeah, Alan J _ Right Fight is my WRITEFIGHT is my Instagram handle. And from there, you can probably find most everything else branching off from that.
Excellent. What was the name of your YouTube channel?
It's Alan Johnson's Writing and Fighting.
Writing and Fighting. I love it. Well, excellent. Alan, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
This was a great time, and let me know about that book when it comes out. I'm very interested.
Me too.
Awesome. Well, you take care, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.